us from. You are warmly welcome to today's webinar put together by the ICCE, the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. And we are going to be having a very insightful discussion on one of the critical sectors of the African economy, which is energy. And of course, you're very privileged to have a very individuals that are very well versed in this area to share some insight with us as far as the African continent is concerned in terms of energy efficiency and access. So I think the last week Thursday, so the ICC together with our partner company CCAR Global, we hosted what we call the Ghana Economic Outlook Summit here in Accra, Ghana, at the headquarters of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. So we discussed typically around energy. So the topic was climate financing, positioning Ghana's economy in the era of energy transition. So we just combined to climate finance and energy transition. And luckily for us today, we have broadened the conversation across the continent, same on energy, access, and efficiency, which is these are very key issues as far as the African economic development is concerned. And yes, we have very individuals that are very much versed in this area to share some insight with us. I would like to know wherever you're joining us from. So if you can just in the comments, in the chat box, just mention your name and which country or city you are currently joining us from. We'd love to know where you're joining us from so that we can all give a shout out. So just in the chat box, just let us know your name and which city you are joining us from. And so without wasting much time, I will just go straight to the point. So this is one and possibly 1.5 hour conversation that we're going to have. Within this 1.5 hours, I will share some information about the ICCE, who we are, what we are about, and of course, we'll zoom into the webinar as well. So we have a moderator and we have a facilitator. So the moderator will take over and you will then usher in our speaker who will then take over, do her presentation. And after that, we have a Q&A session. Very important part, the Q&A session. So those of you who are familiar with Zoom, I think you can check on the Zoom screen, whether on your mobile or your tablet or your desktop or laptop. There's a Q&A button there. That's what we're going to use to bring in all the questions. We would love to make it very interactive. So please do prepare your questions, whether you have it beforehand or as our speaker is presenting, you might come across some questions that you would like her to address. So please, we will involve you as she finishes her presentation so that you can bring your questions to her so that she can address them. So please take note of this and then we'll come to you when it's time for you to bring in your questions. So I'm hearing, so already getting updates. I think we have a lot from Ghana here, Samuel, Ruth, Frank, Eunice. We are from Ghana, Tanzania. There is a lot in Tanzania. From Tanzania again. We're getting people from different countries joining us. So I'll just take the next 1 minute to just show a brief information about the ICCE, the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists, that has put together this webinar and many other platforms that we are creating around the world to engineer conversation that brings knowledge to bear and of course try to help countries chart the agenda. Of course, we have Jenkins from Uganda as well joining us. So the ICCE, I have some short videos that I will share on my screen. After that, I'll just say 1 or 2 important stuff, and then we can just go straight into point. And of course, I'll share the link to the ICCE's website in the chat box. So those of you who want to know more about the ICCE and want to be part of it, then you can definitely do that. Sure.
progress.
The most difficult questions about life, our society, and the world economy at large. The answers we seek are inextricably linked to the commitments we make and the action we take. At the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists, ICCE, our commitment is to raise professional economists with the highest ethical standards through quality education and collaborative learning. Our global network of economists professionals are challenging conventional wisdom, advancing ideas, and contributing to the transformational agenda of the world economy. ICCE is raising economists globally, and you too can be one. Make the smart choice and become an ICCE charter holder today. Join the ICCE today and let's measure up. www.charteredeconomists.org.
Yes, so that was it about the ICCE. So the ICCE basically stands for the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. So this is a global professional qualification program for anyone that is already in the field of economics or aspiring to pursue a career as an economist. And just like other professional qualification that we are all aware of, the ICCE, the first step is to register to become a learner. And once you become a learner, you have the chance to go through the series of curriculum that we have, which are structured in 4 levels. So we have level 1, level 2, level 3, and then we have the final level, which is the professional specialization. So what typically happens as a learner, you have to go through the first 3 levels. And then once you are done, you get a chance to specialize in any of the specialization areas that we have. So in the previous video that I played, you saw that we have what we call the petroleum economist, energy, health, managerial, financial, agriculture, health, managerial, marine, international, industrial, and labor economics. So what it means is that once you complete the first 3 levels, you have the option to select any of these specialized areas. So for example, you could become a chartered health economist or a chartered petroleum economist. In the case of this conversation that we are having, you would like to specialize in the area of energy. So you take what we call this chartered energy economist gateway. So that is how you specialize. Now with the ICCE, as it stands, we are offering scholarship opportunities for all our learners, irrespective of where you are in the world, whether you're in the States, whether in the UK, or any country in Asia or Africa. Once you are a learner of the ICCE, you have the opportunity to apply for a merit-based scholarship. And of course, we are running various types of scholarship that fits everyone. So we have what we call the Future Economist Scholarship. So here, it's open to everyone. As long as you are an ICCE learner, you can apply for the Future Economist Scholarship. We have the Women Economist Network Scholarship. So here, if you're a female and you are part of the ICCE, then that will be your best scholarship gateway to apply for. We have Media Professional Scholarship for all those in the media that are doing business reporting and all of that. And of course, we have what we call the Faculty Scholarship. So for teachers and lecturers that are tutoring in any course related to economics that fits the ICCE curriculum, those faculty members can also apply for the ICCE Faculty Scholarship. And so that is what we have about the ICCE. I will share the link to our website to you in the chat box. So if you have any, if you want more information, kindly visit our website to read more about it. I'll also drop my email so you can personally send me any information requests and I will be happy to address them. I am Paul Frimpong. I'm the Global Head of Membership Services for the ICCE, and I'm privileged to be your host for today's webinar. And so we'll be getting deeper into the conversation shortly. So we are very happy that all of you have joined us from different countries. We are hoping that more people will join us as well as we progress. So today we are going to be delving into a very important subject, which borders around energy efficiency and access. And energy, once we talk about energy, obviously we all know the importance of energy to every economy. If you fall short in your energy efficiency and access, then definitely you know that you're going to be facing very serious economic situation, as everything almost runs on energy as we have it. So today we are very privileged to have a gentleman and a lady to lead us through the conversation. So we have our moderator called Jenkins Myron Nelson. He's a principal revenue officer and a statistics officer at the Uganda Electricity Transmission Company Limited. I think they have various companies, they have generation, they have transmission. So he is in the Transmission Company Limited. He's an energy economist. He's a member of the ICCE, and he's based in Kampala, Uganda. So Jenkins, please, I will hand over to you now so you can introduce our speaker and of course, run us through the webinar. Again, quick notes, please, we will come to you for the Q&A. So kindly ensure that you prepare your questions and then drop it in the Q&A box, and then we'll read out to our speaker at the end of the presentation so she can address them. Thank you to you all, and I wish all of us a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Paul, for the brief introduction about ICCE. Good day and welcome to this webinar on the key drivers of energy efficiency and access in Africa. I'm glad to see a good level of participation today on this very exciting topic. But before we start, I would like to thank ICCE once again, who have supported the organization of this webinar. I'm delighted to welcome all attendants that have today made it, and also to introduce our topic. I'll give a brief overview before introducing our speaker. For the past years, the subject of energy efficiency and access has been near and very dear to policymakers in our countries. However, not much progress has been made in this regard over the years. And as we speak, around in Africa, about half of the population are without access to modern energy, and the majority rely on use of biomass such as charcoal and firewood as their primary source of energy. However, evidence suggests that energy efficiency can significantly improve the economics of energy access by lowering the initial investment in the new generation required. So if you are to adopt energy efficiency measures, indirectly you will be lowering the initial investment cost required, as well as reducing the ongoing fuel costs. I'd also like to indicate that according to some estimates, using the currently available energy efficiency measures could result in the delivery of universal access to modern energy services using about 50 to 80% less energy than we are currently using. So this topic is of paramount importance to Africa at large. This webinar will explore insights into the key drivers of energy efficiency and energy access in Africa. In terms of energy access, if we look at the urban electrification access in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, it's estimated at around 60%. However, if we look at the rural areas, it is very low at 14%. So it is from this background that we need to have insights into this topic of energy efficiency. Our agenda today, with the 1 hour allocated, we will have a presentation from our speaker of the day, We'll also have a Q&A session. So would like to see your questions. If you have any questions to the presenter, please, you can send them through during the presentation to the chat box, and they will be attended to and responded to at the end of the presentation. So finishing with this housekeeping, I would now have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Laura Pinke, who is a senior international trade specialist in energy and focusing on the African continent from the UK Department for International Trade. Laura has worked for over 15 years in the private and public sector with a focus on trade, investment, and economic development. Her primary objective has been to assist private sector companies in the energy and infrastructure sectors with a geographical focus on markets in Africa. She has advised clients on aspects such as local content, market opportunities, making connections, and assisting with financial support. In addition, she has worked on government initiatives in a number of countries in advancing manufacturing, developing blue economy strategies, port concessions, and government-led renewable procurement. With a background in chemistry and a master's in development finance, Laura's passion is to see Africa reach its full potential through collaboration, innovation, and smart solution in the development finance arena. So without much ado, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our speaker. Laura, you're welcome.
Jenkins, thank you so much. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I feel incredibly privileged, and it is my absolute pleasure to be able to share my presentation with you today. I just want to double check, Jenkins, that you can see the presentation.
Yes, I can see the presentation.
Perfect. I'm just going to maximize. Okay, so just a little bit about myself. As Jenkins has already mentioned, I have a background in chemistry. I've studied my Masters of Commerce and Development Finance. And for me, the most important thing is that I'm a born and bred South African. I was born on the continent of Africa. I have many ties to a number of countries through my parents, who were both born outside of South Africa, but on the continent itself. And I'm extremely passionate about seeing Africa reach its full potential for Africa by Africa. And it's something that I've really spent a lot of time on in my career. It's something I'm still hoping to spend a lot more time on in my career. And as I've said, it is my absolute pleasure to present to you today. Please feel free to ask questions. I admit there's no way that I'm possibly going to be able to cover everything in a couple of slides during the presentation time slot. I have included my contact details on the last slide as well, and you are more than welcome to reach out to me separately if you feel the need. So just a little bit about who I work for at the moment. So I am based in South Africa. I work for the UK Department for International Trade, as well as Scottish Development International. They are joined. So even though Scotland has its own government, separate from the UK government, they deal with trade policy and development on the continent jointly. As a result, although my primary work was with Scottish Development International, you should see the two as being combined. And sorry to say, just let me make a note right now. I am at home. My children are crying in the background, and my voice is also croaky because I've had a bit of a cold. So sorry for the background noises. Who is Scottish Development International? So it is the trade and investment arm of the Scottish Government. It works together with Scottish Enterprise, which is the international branch in terms of trade and industry. And it is a single point of contact for all international business development needs. So we work with Scottish companies that have trade and investment routes internationally. We work with a number of partner organizations. But something that is really important to me, and the reason that I was happy to join Scottish Development International when they asked me to apply for the position, was that they very much value a mutually beneficial and sustainable partnership. So they don't look to just support Scottish companies coming into a market. It must be mutually beneficial, and the partnership must benefit both sides of the table. And that's really important, because I very much see partnerships as a massive mechanism in which Africa can achieve a lot of its objectives. I firmly believe that Africa can achieve a lot of its challenge, or provide solutions to a lot of its challenges itself. But I also believe that partnerships are vital in being able to address those challenges and find those solutions. Without further ado, Jenkins has given us a bit of context to the African market and exactly what he's mentioned. In terms of access to electricity or energy, almost 50% of the continent of Africa in terms of population still do not have access to energy. Of course, that is higher in most urban areas and much lower in most rural areas. And if you delve into those numbers a little bit differently, you'll see that of the African countries, currently 24 of those have less than 50% access to energy, which is a pretty substantial number, given the fact that we've got massive economies. And at a very high level, if you're looking at key drivers of energy access in Africa, we'll come to the energy efficiency question a little bit later. But the urbanization rate, increasing industrialization and trade, the fact that we've got a massive demand in growth are all sort of typical drivers that you would find across most markets, but I think more so in Africa. The other aspect on the financial side, again touching on this at a very high level, and we'll go into the finance aspect a little bit later. I think what is really interesting is that consumer market, so similar to sort of the drive for demand in mobile phones or cellular access, what we're seeing is a similar sort of investment interest from the global community into Africa when it comes to energy access. There are different components to that. There are, of course, electrical grid infrastructure, something that Jenkins, of course, works in. And there are different aspects of electrical grid infrastructure that you can consider. But then there's also sort of the hardware and supply chain aspect of that. There's also the policy framework and government-led developments that encourages private sector investment. But suffice to say, I think that the continent as a whole has still got a massive role to play. As we all know, biomass still traditionally forms the biggest sort of source of energy on the continent, which not many people outside of the continent would actually know that figure. It's a far cry from Europe, the US, a lot of Southeast Asia, where biomass is not traditionally the key source of electricity generation. Africa's renewables focus, of course, you just need to look at certain countries to get a good picture of that. But I just want to be clear on it that traditionally we're looking at things, subsectors of renewables such as hydropower, biomass, geothermal, which is a really sort of big growing area and a topic that a lot of countries are doing some amazing work in terms of investment and trade promotion. Solar and wind. And when we refer to wind with respect to the African continent, we are, of course, talking about onshore. There are no offshore wind developments currently on the continent in either planning or development. From a country perspective, countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Morocco, and Ghana have really shown sort of firm commitment in terms of accelerating their focus towards a more diverse, more sustainable energy mix in terms of their country's energy generation opportunities. And that would, of course, include modern renewable energy technologies. But having said that, some of Africa's smallest sort of countries, including Cape Verde, Djibouti, Rwanda, Swaziland, and Lesotho, have also set ambitious renewable energy targets. And I think one of the things that I often find is a really important quote or comment when it comes to thinking about Africa and its energy opportunities is that the lack of energy access at the moment actually for me provides that it is the opportunity, isn't it? There are different ways of monetizing that, different ways of getting companies involved, different ways of looking at partnerships. But that lack means that there is an opportunity, and that's where countries really can position themselves. Solar energy markets on the continent are a particular source of sort of success story. over the last 2 to 3 years, 1.8 gigawatts of new solar installations, mainly driven by 5 countries of Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, and Ghana, has really been a success story. And Vera Songwe, who is the United Nations Under Secretary General for the UN Economic Commission for Africa, her quote for me really stands out, and that is that she says, "The good news is that the compelling case for clean energy in Africa has never been stronger than now, with so much demand for energy owing to population growth, increasing urbanization, industrialization and trade, and climate change, amongst other factors." And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a couple of the next slides. So it would be remiss not to consider oil and gas. And I know the big focus globally, the big focus at COP, the COP conferences internationally, the last one, COP26 being held in Glasgow last year, and COP27 coming up in Egypt this year. And I think the fact that it's on the continent of Africa is extremely relevant and a massive opportunity for all of us to capitalize on. I think it would be remiss not to mention the fact that I firmly believe that Africa has or should have its own developmental agenda when it comes to energy access. It does not mean that Africa's energy development needs to be totally focused on renewables. I think that the more sustainable approach to this is looking at the holistic, diversified energy mix for each and every single country on the continent. And you cannot deny that oil and gas still makes up a massive part of that. Paul, yeah.
Yes, sorry to interrupt, Laura. I think your slides are not moving. They're not. Slideshow. So
just give me a second. Okay, I'm going to just unplug. Sorry, I'm going to just disconnect. I can reshare again if it's a mission.
Yes, now it's perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so you're seeing the oil and gas projects in Africa slide.
That's correct. I see.
Sorry about that. So I must apologize. There must be a little bit of a delay on my internet connection. And as I said, it would be remiss not to consider the sort of projects of interest. Now, this is by no means, a full project list of a number of projects in Africa. And again, I've mentioned to Paul and to Jenkins that I will make these slides available. So I realize that it may not be 100% clear on the screen. However, the slides will be a lot clearer in PDF once you receive a copy. But I think it's important to note here that, and you can see by the list of sort of projects of interest, these are all current projects that are being tracked as live, and there's a fairly good mix of oil and gas projects across the continent. Of course, there are the traditional markets in oil and gas, Angola, Nigeria, up-and-coming markets on the East African coasts in Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique. But I think what's also really interesting here is that while we see projects in the typical oil and gas markets in Africa, you shouldn't forget that there are a lot of developed countries such as Egypt, such as South Africa, such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, which also have important supply chains that follow behind them. Again, that all contributes to sort of the question around key drivers looking at sustainability. Many of the countries that have big oil and gas projects that are listed on this page and that are up and coming are also projects that are also countries, should I say, that have a focus on looking at energy transition and diversifying their energy mix. A little bit about the oil and gas CapEx expenditure. Again, information pulled from the Energy Industries Council data stream website. And many thanks to them for allowing me to use some of their information in the slides today. But you can see, and again, speaking to those oil and gas traditional countries, Angola, Nigeria, Egypt, the up-and-coming markets in East Africa, and then a couple of smaller projects. A good mixture between upstream, midstream, and downstream, but some fairly big CapEx numbers there. And I think that that's really encouraging because, again, governments, countries, and private sector all need investment, and that comes from multiple sources. From a operator perspective, again, the typical sort of companies that you would expect to see in oil and gas: Shell, ExxonMobil, Eni, a number of sort of companies from more sort of Asian markets starting to make a bit more of an appearance in terms of CapEx investment. I think what is interesting is that we're starting to see companies such as Shell, such as Total, rebranding and becoming much more focused on an energy transition space. And it's good for countries that have these companies already active in them. It means that they have an existing platform, an existing investment appetite for those markets, and those should not be forgotten when it comes to looking at a diversified energy portfolio. Launching into sort of, well, a bridging gap between oil and gas and the renewables or clean energy focus. Obviously, you cannot generate energy without sort of power generation infrastructure, electrical grid infrastructure, be it distribution, transmission, or generation capacity. And I think the graph on the right-hand side of the slide, the capacity additions by technology in terms of megawatts, in terms of either proposed and or under development projects, really interesting with respect to Africa. So hydropower comes out first and foremost. That is slightly skewed by a number of big hydropower projects. Of course, there are the sort of, the projects that are well known in East Africa, Ethiopia, but we've also seen a couple of projects in Cabo Verde, and there are a number of proposed hydropower schemes in countries such as Mozambique, linking them to the rest of the Southern African power pool. Solar PV, again, Africa's success story in terms of renewables. It's a no-brainer that we see that is, probably one of the more sort of traditional renewable technologies that is up and coming in terms of megawatt capacity being added. We do see carbon capture and storage. We see gas. We see sort of nuclear still being put on the table there. However, having said that, that is probably going to change significantly over the next couple of years. We also see onshore wind being a massive player. And again, you'll see that they've included offshore wind there as a tab, but there are no current megawatt capacity additions, either proposed or under development. And then I think it's important to just touch on some of the clean tech projects. And we've used the word clean tech rather than renewables only, because we do include transition projects, so carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies. And these would be considered transition projects rather than renewables. But I think for Africa, this really tells the story of how many countries, so countries such as Angola, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, are all markets that are kind of saying we've got massive oil and gas portfolios. How do we start talking about an energy transition? We don't want to just go straight to renewables. We will consider those. But carbon capture, utilization and storage, or carbon capture and storage and geothermal projects, particularly in East Africa, countries such as Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania are doing some amazing work in terms of promoting their geothermal market opportunities. And again, we see a number of different projects, particularly headlining Africa's renewable commitments. So the NUA concentrated solar plants, as well as the photovoltaic solar projects in Morocco, are massive projects and are literally some of the biggest CSP plants in the world. And again, that puts Africa on the map from a renewables perspective. So you can see that those aspects of urbanization, increasing demand, and investor-friendly policies do have an impact on how countries consider clean tech projects in and around the continent of Africa. There is, of course, a much bigger list than this, and there are a lot more projects both installed and under development, but these are just a couple to highlight some of the projects of interest that are perhaps not as well known. So just touching on the economics, the socioeconomic impacts of clean energy. Why would countries look at it? Apart from the obvious question in terms of access to energy and bridging the gap. And I think that that's a really important aspect for considering energy access in Africa. There is no doubt that renewables or clean energy solutions do have the potential to create much shorter term solutions to market than traditional energy. Traditional energy projects such as oil and gas or coal-fired power stations, nuclear plants have long lead times, whereas we can look at a lot of decentralized, and or off-grid or microgrid solutions in terms of renewables and clean energy for the African market that can serve both urban and rural areas, and don't necessarily need as much grid infrastructure in many cases as big power plants, and that would of course need. I've included a fairly useful graph, and if you have not had an opportunity to look at the report by, it's a report primarily published by the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. It was released in February of this year, but it is a fantastic report looking at the socioeconomic impacts of clean energy and the energy transition with respect to Africa. And this image or graphic, should I say, for me really captures that clean energy or access to energy is so much more than just GDP growth and job creation. It impacts people's lives on the ground. It provides them with warm water to be able to have baths, wash food, provide clean drinking water. It's a lot more than just, as I say, an economics game. One of the things I'd really like to touch on here is that the youth, and of course we know Africa has a massive population of young people. What we do see is that countries that have big populations of young people are typically countries that are more aggressive in terms of diversifying their energy mix and moving towards more clean energy or renewable energy solutions. They are also enablers of technology and innovation, which then provides a solution to challenges such as access to energy. Some of the economics around access to clean energy include, and these are included in the report, you can go and have a look at the details behind them, but it is globally well known that a 1% growth in GDP creates a 0.5% additional demand for electricity. So whatever your baseline electricity is, if you have a 1% growth in GDP, that will create additional demand for electricity. That also means that you then need to upgrade infrastructure in many cases, and that does have costs associated with that. And that is why continents such as Africa do tend to fall behind in many cases, because we do have countries with substantial GDP growth. The energy transition under the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, which of course is an ambition of the COP conferences, offers Africa the possibility of a 6.5% higher GDP between the period of 2021 to 2050. Now that may not sound so substantial given the time period, but if you consider the fact that many countries are dreaming of a GDP of this nature, any increase or contribution towards GDP does provide support and assistance. And that, of course, enables countries to leverage funds, both from an investment perspective and both from public and private sources. New technologies. So I think that this is something that is really, we wouldn't be able to touch on the sort of key drivers if we didn't look at new technologies. I think Africa has a really unique opportunity here that they can adopt technologies from other markets, from other companies, from other governments, and leapfrog a lot of the sort of time that it's taken for many countries to create their own diversified energy mix or move from sort of fossil fuel dependent energy generation economies to being more renewables dependent. A country like Scotland, as an example, in the last 8 years has moved from being 100% fossil fuel dependent from a energy generation perspective to 98% renewables generated as of last year, and the aim would be to reach 100% this year. However, I do want to emphasize that I really believe that innovation needs to come from Africa for Africa. And I've included a couple of images on the right-hand side of the screen that speak to just 4 of those technologies that really address a particular need in terms of energy access. So access to solar heating solutions that provide warm and clean drinking water is a massive challenge to rural areas because you don't always have the right pitch on a roof. You don't necessarily have a grid. How do you tie it in? What happens if you don't have engineers or people that are trained within your community to install? And we have a company that has a partnership with a Rwandan-based NGO. And they are developing flat packs, so i.e. you can assemble it yourself. It's almost like a pop-up solar thermal collector that you can put on a flat roof. and it provides clean and warm drinking water at a 50% reduction of cost, as well as a low carbon footprint. We've got companies that are creating globally competitive biomimicry solutions, so wind blades that will be able to adapt to higher wind speeds without an engineer turning a button. Companies that are providing for solar solutions in countries like Burkina Faso, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and again, the examples abound. There are so many. I can talk the entire day about these particular sort of exciting developments. I think, again, the opportunity to focus on off-grid and decentralized solutions where there's not so much of an investment required into electrical grid infrastructure really can shift the future generation mix for Africa, and we're starting to see a lot more companies get involved. Policy innovation, policy frameworks is a massive shortfall in many countries in Africa today. There are a lot of countries on the continent doing incredible work, and before the session started, I was actually chatting to Jenkins about what Uganda was looking to do, and you cannot deny that policy innovation, policy frameworks that are unique and work for Africa are a critical area in which Africa needs to develop more. They can adopt and adapt from what more developed countries and companies have achieved. It goes without saying that innovation solves challenges, not just in terms of access to electricity, but also lowers the cost of energy. And this is across the board. And of course, with success in solar installation, mostly in photovoltaic technology, on the continent, what we're seeing is that solar energy is now very competitive in many countries. It is, in fact, probably more cost competitive than typical energy produced from coal-fired or nuclear plants. And as I've said before, there are many markets looking at technologies and promoting carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and carbon capture utilization and storage, CCUS, as well as geothermal from oil and gas sources. So maximizing an oil and gas well for a much longer term and more, lower carbon footprint solution. And without the development of technology, this really wouldn't have been the case in the past. Access to finance. So the age-old question, it's great to talk about the demand that are created by those key drivers of industrialization, bigger consumer markets, the rate of urbanization, increasing trade, young populations. But I think it would be remiss not to mention the fact that access to finance can and is often a stumbling block. It is no secret that Africa, I wouldn't say struggles, but there have been stumbling blocks with respect to African markets, African countries seeking and accessing finance. I think one of the best things that has ever happened to the continent is the establishment of the African Development Bank. It is a bank that is created to provide finance for Africa from an African perspective. And we're seeing some amazing projects, sort of platforms that they've established, including the Facility for Energy Inclusion, the FEI program. It's a fantastic program that accelerates deployment of renewable energy solutions, and it is an investment platform operating through 2 dedicated funds. It provides debt financing to off-grid, mini-grid, and small-scale on-grid renewable energy technologies, and they have similar programs for utility-scale grid-connected projects as well. And I think that that's massively encouraging when it comes to looking at access to finance. Good policy frameworks will always encourage private investment. And if I look at the example of Egypt and South Africa as just 2 countries to sort of make an example of, changes to their energy policy, more transparency on their energy policy and the future investment that the government is intending to make has resulted in a number of international and global energy companies making significant investments into their renewables programs. And I think that, again, it's a constant reminder that good policy frameworks create the right environment for investment. And if you've got good policy frameworks, the right environment for investment, you've got all of the potential in the world to be able to access different finance. Maybe one point to just make a mention on there is that grid infrastructure. particularly in Africa, is an area in which export credit agencies or development banks are investing fairly heavily. I know some countries do not like to work with certain export credit agencies because it does give some leverage and influence on policy development, but nonetheless, there are massive success stories in countries like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mozambique, with export credit agencies such as the US Exim Bank, the UK Export Finance, closely followed by the Italian, French, and German export credit agencies. And many of these have changed their policies. So it used to be that if they invested in infrastructure, it would need to be a company from one of their countries. That is no longer the case. They do normally take about a 10, 15, or 20% local content from their own supply chains, but the rest of the supply chain procurement is then left up to local companies, thereby increasing the industrial development in that economy again. It's not a perfect solution, but it is one of the solutions. And lastly, just to kind of touch on that statistic that I've included at the top of the slide, that 50% of Africa's electricity generation capacity could be provided in terms of renewables. The gigawatt capacity that is estimated to be is roughly 310 gigawatts, and as a result, that means that the continent will be looking at an average annual investment of $70 billion, so per annum to 2030. That's a massive amount of money, but again, it is out there and it is an opportunity for Africa to look at accessing various platforms. Just some final thoughts on this. So again, I just want to emphasize the fact that for me, Africa needs to develop its own energy policy in support of its own development needs. And obviously this filters down to each individual country. I'm very cognizant of the fact that Africa cannot have its own policy as a single unit. It would need to be independent of that. Of course, there are various regional power pools that make this a lot easier and can often generate a lot of interest through investment as a result of a stronger value proposition. But it is important that its own development needs are met, and that means a sustainable, diverse energy mix with transparency on how each country is looking to develop that going forward in the future. Embracing partnerships and leveraging lessons learned. Why not? Yes, it should be adapted for the African context or the context of the country in which you live in. But I think, again, why wouldn't Africa want to adopt amazing technologies, see where there's been lessons learned, and help it to grow and reduce that energy access gap. Renewables are a key part of that energy access gap in terms of addressing it, and they can be fairly short-term in nature as well. There are a lot of policy programs and support for countries looking to diversify and ask the question of how do I go from being a fossil fuels only country to a country that has a diversified energy mix. And I want to emphasize the last point here, that skills, education, and training are critical. And again, there are numerous programs available internationally, many of which are sponsored. The World Bank, as an example, provides a lot of training for African governments and companies looking to get involved in a value chain. And I believe that is always the foundation of any country's intentions behind looking at diversifying their energy mix. And again, while we've spoken about the key drivers, all of these factors that we've touched on today are always important when considering looking at energy efficiency, looking at the access to energy, and how countries across the continent create and maximize their future potential. And as I said, my contact details are on the slide. I would be super happy to answer questions. I'm sure there are questions that I have not been able to touch on. And Jenkins, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Laura, for that quite insightful presentation. We now welcome questions and from members. But before they come in, I have one or two questions for you, Laura.
Please.
it's increasingly clear that Africa has the potential to lead the world in scaling up and generating renewable energy. And you indicated that innovation needs to come from Africa for Africa. However, we've not been able to tap into or to harness this potential, especially in terms of unlocking the commercial financing for small-scale renewable energy in Africa. What would be your advice? How can we go about that in trying to unlock?
It's a really fantastic question, because I think that that's the age-old question, isn't it? About how do we make sure that our own technology, our own innovation isn't lost in the quest for trying to just address the energy efficiency and access to energy sort of gap. So I'm going to default, it's not a one size fits all answer, but partnerships for me are a massive part of how we address that. There is no doubt in my mind that when it comes to the question of how do we leverage finance in order to be able to commercialize technologies, to be able to commercialize innovation, I'll give you a really good example, actually. There's a company in South Africa called Brayfoil Technologies. As I've said, they are developing a biomimicry solution for wind turbines. And they've got pilot plants and that across South Africa. But one of their biggest challenges was that nobody in the wind turbine manufacturing industry, of which there are a handful of companies internationally, were sort of willing to pick up the phone and speak to them and say, yes, we're looking to adopt a technology like this. Until they formed a partnership with the UK's Net Zero Technology Centre. The Net Zero Technology Centre enabled Brayfoil Technologies to be able to access grant funding in British pounds, and they were also able to trial and demonstrate their technology at a number of the wind blade manufacturing companies in Europe, coming out of Spain and Denmark. And as a result, they have subsequently signed a joint venture agreement with one of the world's biggest turbine manufacturers. Now, we wouldn't have been able to support so a company like Brayfoil would not necessarily have been able to leverage that same opportunity, despite being a company from South Africa, or a company from the continent, for the continent, because we know that there's only a handful of international turbine manufacturers. And as I said, the partnership aspect for me is massive, because sometimes it means we need to almost step out of our continent, find the right partnership to be able to come back to the continent and grow our company, provide that socioeconomic impact as an employer, a contribution to GDP, etc. And again, it's not a one size fits all. We are starting to see a lot more projects getting support from various grant funding platforms. And as I said, the African Development Bank is starting to have access to funds, to investment platforms that are much more able to be able to provide that investment that's very much needed for companies that want to grow, local companies, and I say local as an African local company for the African continent.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it was clear. I will go to the questions in the chat box. Members, if you have any questions, you can send them through the chat box and they will be attended to. The first question is from Michael. What is the cost of power in Scotland?
A good question.
Michael is looking at the end user tariff, the end user price.
You should be aware that energy in most of Europe and the UK is much higher in general than most of Africa. It sounds a little bit surprising to say that, but in many cases, and it's a lot of reasons for it. But as an example, one of the biggest challenges that countries like the UK and countries in Europe have is that they have limited access to land. And as a result, projects are a lot more complex to develop, and then that increases costs. Whereas Africa has access to land. Comparatively speaking, most of Africa's sort of energy costs, and again, I'm obviously Each country is different. But most of Africa's countries' energy costs, if you are able to access energy from the grid, are generally cheaper than most of the UK and the European Union countries. However, we would find that would be much more expensive than countries like the US, where there was massive infrastructure rolled out many, many years ago. And despite being a massive continent, they have easy access to multiple sources of energy, both from natural gas, from renewables, coal. There's a range of different things. Having said that, the recent, and again, I will get the statistics for you and I'll include them in my presentation, but the current costs of solar PV in South Africa and many of the countries in Africa are some of the most competitive in the world. Some of that is due to the programs run by different countries. They are competitive bid processes. But having said that, even microgrid projects in countries like Burkina Faso, in countries such as, I think we were looking at Ghana the other day, these are not necessarily whole-scale projects that are available to sort of the entire country yet, but they're still getting really good, really competitive costs of energy.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Hope your question has been answered. But
I will include that in my presentation. Jenkins, sorry, I will include the costs on in my presentation. I'll make a change and add that for information.
Okay, that's noted. That's noted. The next question: what is hindering the promotion of conversion of municipal solid waste into energy in Africa?
Sorry, what's hindering the promotion of conversion of? Oh, okay, so this is waste to energy. Is generally a very specific country-related question. So it depends on how municipal structures are created. We know that there are massive opportunities in markets such as Kenya for waste-to-energy projects that would not need to be run by municipalities or local governments. However, one of the biggest challenges at the moment, and again, this is a generalization, but what we're seeing is that municipalities generate revenue from either wheeling energy or providing a solution like a waste to energy from a landfill site, recycling. There are a number of different options, of course, but municipalities generate revenue from that, and it's a massive infill for their revenue sort of models. And without it, municipalities, I think, are feeling the pressure or the concern that they wouldn't have access to that revenue source. And as a result, legislation tends to protect the municipality rather than allowing for a free market. We see the same things in countries like South Africa, in countries like Egypt. There are exceptions to this rule across the continent, but by and large, in fact, it's not just a waste to energy question. The local government or municipal restrictions around generating your own electricity are typically because municipalities fear the loss of revenue from being able to pass on energy generated by themselves.
Because that also provides an opportunity, and it will be a win-win in terms of handling the problem of waste management, as well as being able to manage energy that waste. So there is need to tap into that potential. The next question, Lady Fee is asking, please kindly send your email or contact here. I think you'll do that.
Absolutely, I will do that quickly.
How does renewable energy survive in the midst of the growing oil and gas sector across Africa?
Fantastic question. And again, I mean, I just want to state that I fully support the fact that many countries in Africa should continue looking at oil and gas. You know, it's a part of the energy mix. It's a part of the revenue opportunity for those markets. Just because it's a controversial statement to make, but just because we've got climate change targets doesn't mean that Africa shouldn't look at its own development needs and answer its own development needs in its own way. So again, I want to emphasize the fact that I still very much support countries and projects that look at oil and gas. I think statistically, if you look at the continent of Africa, we are only responsible for something like 4% of the world's carbon emissions, despite the fact that, of course, as a continent, we make up a much bigger percentage, 3 or 4 times that in terms of land mass and population, of course. So we are by no means the world's biggest contributors, and many other countries have developed their industrial revolutions on the back of fossil fuels. I very much believe that oil and gas forms part of an energy mix for any country looking at their future. However, I do believe that if you're wanting to be able to grow your economy, and this goes for any of the countries across the continent, you need to have a diversified energy mix. It cannot just be oil and gas, because we've seen what happens to countries that are primarily oil and gas focused in terms of government revenue generation. When things like the oil price decline, those economies are left extremely vulnerable and dependent on other economies, other governments, other bailouts. And that's why I'm saying and emphasizing a mix, a sustainable, diversified energy mix that includes oil and gas, that includes energy transition projects, that includes renewables and clean energy, is a very important consideration for any sort of country and market. How do you survive? Again, my first thing would be always research the markets that you're looking to do. There are so many opportunities. And again, looking at more developed economies in terms of renewable energy, such as Egypt and South Africa. 10 years ago, South Africa didn't have renewables, even as kind of like a point in its energy mix. And yet it's one of the biggest contributors to the energy grid today. And if it wasn't for the renewables, you wouldn't be speaking to me today, because we wouldn't have energy or enough to at least generate power for 2 hours a day. And I think that that's our biggest challenge, that, each and every market is unique, and we do need to give consideration to the fact that you need to find the sweet spot. There is not one size fits all. There are some amazing examples of success. National governments do have a major role to play in creating procurement opportunities, but we've also seen incredible success stories of decentralized microgrid or off-grid solutions where governments are not involved, and finance has been able to be leveraged in that. So find the sweet spot, do the market research in each market that you're looking at, and see where the legislation allows you to play.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's say a hard debate on in terms of renewable and oil and gas in Africa, especially given the revenue streams from the oil and gas. But I think it's also important to use the proceeds from oil and gas to invest in sustainable renewable energy sources, so as to achieve the UN development goals. The other question is from Michelle. What is the liability of renewable plants to sustain industries in Europe?
Really good question. So Europe itself tends to be a little bit of like they tend to present this front that we only generate renewable energy. We don't look at coal or nuclear power plants anymore, which of course is not 100% true. We've seen things like the Ukraine-Russia war, where countries like Germany have been left massively lacking in terms of access, simply because they import all of their gas from Russia. So they often wave a green flag and say we're 100% green. It's not always 100% of the case. The UK and Scotland tend to be very sort of, in terms of their own energy generation, are very renewable based. And as I said, in terms of their energy access, they are majority renewable derived in terms of the gigawatt generation capacity that they require. Europe is a little bit different. We've got countries, of course, across Europe that still develop, that still produce power from nuclear plants. which of course would not be considered renewable. A lot of, again, Europe is constrained by land access and lack of solar irradiation. So what you'll typically find there is that their reliability on renewable plants is a lot lower, but still higher than the average African country. So megawatt, or should I say gigawatt wise, so a country like Scotland, as an example, requires 50 gigawatts of power annually to be able to sustain its energy requirements. As I've said, 98% of that 50 gigawatts is 100% produced by renewables. And where they do have oil and gas investment still, a lot of that is then sold on to other European markets. If you compare, as an example, if 98% of Scotland's energy requirements are generated by mostly offshore wind, if you compare that to the continent of Africa, at the moment, we are only making use of less than 1% of our potential onshore wind generation capacity. And that just gives you a bit of a, even though Europe is not 100% green like they would like us to believe, their reliability on renewables is not as high as you would think. It still is much higher than many of our African countries in terms of solutions. And again, the nuance here is to emphasize the fact that even if you don't have grid infrastructure, you can provide renewable or clean energy solutions off-grid or microgrid at a much lower fraction of the cost. And that would address that energy gap that we have in many countries in Africa much more sustainably or much quicker.
Thank you. We have a question from Eugenie. Hope that's the right pronunciation. The reason why he asked the question is they are currently embarking, Eugene is from Ghana. He's saying they are currently embarking on a renewable energy, that is conversion in Ghana by adopting gasification technology, almost done, securing 100 acres of land towards the project.
Yes.
So this is in relation to how does renewable energy survive? Is it in regard to that?
Yeah, so I mean, interesting, Eugene, that you mentioned the land access. So that is a big question in Africa with regards to any energy development. Access and security of land is the first principle in being able to access finance or securing finance for a project. So it's a great first step. And again, I've emphasized the point that I see Africa's energy mix not just only for renewables and clean energy, but also from oil and gas. We see countries like yourself in Ghana, countries like Angola, really sort of saying, well, what can we actually do to use our oil and gas resources and use them for the energy transition questions? So carbon capture and storage, geothermal, again, and there are many technologies, many amazing innovations globally where companies can actually assist governments in being able to map those resources. So having those resources is not the issue. What you're speaking about here also is being able to sort of monetize them, which is also really important. So land security being a big thing, and I'm so glad that you touched on that because it's something I didn't touch on, and it's something we see often as a big question. We're working on a project in Zambia at the moment. The project is a go-ahead. The government has given the guarantees, but the land rights are not secured, and therefore the project cannot continue because no one will put money behind it until that project, the land rights are guaranteed. Again, just to kind of also emphasize that conversion by adopting gasification technology, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how many countries, should I say, are looking at their energy transition strategy. And in many cases, done with the right technologies. And again, this is about adopting and adapting technologies internationally. If you do that as a country, you can absolutely create a huge solution in terms of energy generation for your own market from your own resources.
Okay, I think that is clear. There is a question here from Nana. And the question is, there seems to be no motivation from governments for individuals to go green sources of energy. What has been your experience in this area from other countries? I think is looking at incentives.
So
There
are some countries in Africa that are starting to look at incentives. Yes, I have to admit they are few and far between, and they are often not well developed. Or a government will, let me say, put a plaster solution, a band-aid solution, by creating an incentive, and it's not necessarily the right incentive for a market. However, if you look at sort of the economics behind many countries like Singapore, the UK, Europe, their governments had to incentivize renewable or green technologies before mass adoption of those technologies kind of took place. So it's a very similar case again in a market like Egypt. The Egyptian government has, in many cases, driven procurement. And when there's procurement behind a government entity providing national guarantees at utility scale projects, why wouldn't an international energy company look at a partnership with a local energy company and respond to something like that? On the microgrid side, you'll find that a lot of that is being led by NGOs, so entities like the World Bank, the UN, Economic Commission for Africa, UNICA, are all big partners in being able to sort of drive that leverage. I think in many cases, again, the age-old question of why are governments not incentivizing this? You know, a lot of Africa's markets have been very over-regulated from an energy perspective, and you will find in most of our markets that there is a single power utility. And let's be honest, at the moment, the energy generation from renewables is still very up and down. So the biggest challenge for a power utility is I must be a taker for someone providing renewables power back onto the grid, but then what happens to my investments, the capital that I have had to raise both debt and equity to be able to build infrastructure? How do I pay that back if I've got less users today than I had yesterday? It is a big conundrum for Africa, and it's not something that is solved quickly. Again, that emphasis on policy frameworks and how they develop, and how Africa also adopts and adapts how other countries globally have transitioned their own power utilities and their regulation around the energy sector is a massive part of that. In terms of incentives, I could spend hours talking about each one. There are so many. We've spoken about the waste to energy topic. There are incentives for individuals, residents, and businesses putting solar panels on their roofs. Many countries do have that in Africa. However, they are often for a short-term period and often test-based. So the government will use it as a sort of pilot project, and that's not a bad thing. Because you don't necessarily have a perfect answer right up front. You often have to adapt something. But if we do look at utility scale, many countries around the world, the governments have had to incentivize it in order to drive investment into it. Once there is investment, people can see the value of it, and then it naturally takes its own course, and government can slowly but surely pull out. So hopefully that answers that question.
Hello, Jenkins. Let me just step in. So I'll just go straight to Q&A. We just ask our final two questions and then we'll wrap it up while we wait for Jenkins to attach. So this is from Emmanuel. So Emmanuel is asking, how disruptive will energy transition be to African development? How slow or fast will African countries transition to cleaner energy sources?
Good question. So I think by the nature of the fact that clean energy is considered a disruptive technology, it doesn't need to be a negative. It can actually be a positive as well. And I think that that's something that we should always keep in mind. Change is always a bit of a scary thing. Again, how countries look to embrace it rather than completely say, no, we'll never do any renewables. We won't have renewables as our mix because why should? We've got oil and gas. you do need to consider that there are external influences to your market. And I think the faster that African governments embrace that diversified energy mix, the better for their country and their country's economy and for the potential of people. If they're embracing a diversified energy mix, it also means that they're willing to look at education, skills and training programs that uplift citizens. And that also means that the citizens of the country won't have as much fear about losing jobs. So if I'm employed in the oil and gas sector today, and my government's now talking about renewables as part of the energy mix in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, what happens to me? What about my employment? Education and training forms the basis of any sort of economy. Yes, as I've said, disruptive does mean disruptive, but it doesn't need to be seen as a negative. In terms of African countries, there is no answer to fast or slow. Again, so if you look at South Africa's renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, the government first started talking about that in the early 2000s. And what they talked about and proposed in the early 2000s to what was actually launched post 2010 or between sort of 2010 and 2020 are two completely different things. And dialogue is important. Engaging private sector, businesses, your citizens are all really important in terms of how you address that question of how fast or slow. It's always going to be a learning experience. It's never going to be something that just happens overnight. So I generally take the view that it happens slower rather than faster. But I also think that there's a lot of money out there at the moment that governments are throwing at the African continent to say, start looking at renewables, start looking at transition technologies. And if you want to access that, then you have an opportunity. The faster you are, the more you're able to access that.
Okay, that's great. So Jenkins, you're back. I'll just ask the question that was left in the Q&A chat box. So you can take over just as the last question, and then we can wrap it up.
Thank you, Aurora. Our last question will come from Ruiz. He's asking, is demand a variable in the provision of renewable energy? And he also thinks that low publicity on renewables can marginalize their diffusion on the continent. What's your take on that?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. I must apologize.
The question is demand a variable in the provision of renewable energy?
So if I understand the question correctly, and sorry if I haven't, but demand is a variable, and that is the biggest challenge to power utilities and governments when it comes to renewable energy, because of course you've got a generation potential. Let's use solar as an example. Solar obviously happens during the day, not at night, not generating energy at night. Yes, you can combine solar with storage options, but that makes your renewable energy source variable. Now, what will typically happen is that in any sort of pre-market study, when you're looking at let's say, utility scale solar project, you will know your base load factor in terms of, well, that sounds misleading, but you'll know what your baseline generation potential or your least sort of solar irradiation factor is, and you'll work on that basis to work out your sort of megawatt potential. That variable does make it really difficult. So let's say you've got a mining house in Zambia and or in Zimbabwe, and they want to be able to generate their own power. The biggest challenge for them is that solar is the most cost-effective renewable technology for them, and they can implement a large-scale project direct for their own offtake. They don't need grid infrastructure. Solar, a mining facility may be 24 hours operational a day. How do they consider a solar solution when they're only generating solar for 12 hours a day max? And then how do they supplement their energy use at night? Many of those companies then want grid access, which either may not be available consistently, or they get charged a massive tariff for it. So there is a never-ending question around that. Fortunately, hybrid solutions, so solar combined with battery storage, and that is becoming a lot more cost effective. It is still a big question for Africa, but that also, if you looked at the solar solution from a variable perspective for microgrids or off-grid houses, it doesn't really matter to them, because all they need, hot water for is at the end of the day to be able to bathe in or to be able to heat water. They can store that water themselves. They don't need constant access to the energy necessarily. So it's a little bit different for decentralized sort of solutions. But it is a question that still has a lot of answers, and that is why many people consider renewables not necessarily as good as grid provided infrastructure. Nonetheless, it does have a much better efficiency, and the cost of it is becoming a lot more competitive against traditional fossil fuels.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for your presentation and the insights on our topic on the key drivers of energy efficiency. Time is not on our side. We have to bring this to an end. I would want to take this opportunity to thank the participants for their time to log in and listen to us. It's a pleasure to always have you on our webinars, which we organize regularly on different topics. And also to thank Paul for the support and the effort in organizing this. Thank you very much. For the members with questions which have not been attended to, we'll take note of them and we'll respond to them in the presentation to be shared with Laura. The questions will be shared with Laura, and she will respond to those questions, and they will be submitted together with the presentation. Thank you once again, and I want to hand over to Paul.
Yes, thank you very much, Jenkins. Thank you very much, Laura. It's been very fruitful and insightful. I think a lot has been shared here. And the good news is that this webinar was recorded. So we'll make it available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share the link on our website as well as via email to all attendees. And of course, as Laura has promised, she'll be sending a PDF version of her presentation, which you update with some of the questions that were asked. And if that is available to me, I'll also share it by email to all participants, so you can definitely go over. And I think we shared her email address as well. So in case you have any other direct questions you would like to ask her, please do so and send her an email. I'm sure she'll be more than happy to assist. So this webinar has been brought to you by the ICCE, the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists, which is a global network, a society of economists. We're offering the Chartered Economist Qualification Program for anyone that wants to pursue a career as an economist. And as we do, we have various platforms, various conferences, webinars, and summits. As it stands now, this year in November, we are hosting what we call the Global Economic Ideas Festival, which will be held in Mumbai, India, in November 23rd and 24th. We are hosting the Global Economic Ideas Festival. We have notable speakers from the World Bank, the IMF, from the Afrasian Bank, African Development Bank, some of the development agencies, and of course, private CEOs and executives will be attending this summit. So you may check it out on our website as well. There's a Global Economic Ideas Festival. And so if you are here and you would like to be part of it, we will definitely be happy to see you there. So thank you very much for all of you for joining us. And thank you, Laura. We so much appreciate this gesture, and we'll definitely keep in touch with you all. Thank you.
A pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Each day, we are faced with asking the most difficult questions about life, our society, and the world economy at large. The answers we seek are inextricably linked to the commitments we make and the actions we take. At the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists, ICCE, our commitment is to raise professional economists with the highest ethical standards through quality education and collaborative learning. Our global network of economists professionals are challenging conventional wisdom, advancing ideas, and contributing to the transformational agenda of the world economy. ICCE is raising economists globally, and you too can be one. Make the smart choice and become an ICCE charter holder today. Join the ICCE today and let's measure up. www.charteredeconomists.org